Boeing 747 carrying 254 people flew over 3,000 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean. It was just moments away from a safe landing. Fate played a deadly joke at the final moment. A diagonal line led the plane straight into a mountain peak. The violent impact claimed 229 precious lives, leaving only 25 lucky survivors. This accident became the fourth deadliest aviation tragedy in U.S. history. The entire aviation world was shaken. Hello everyone, this is the Oddity Observation Room. I am Chong Fong. So what exactly happened back then? Let us travel back to August 5, 1997, and step into this tragedy. Guam is an isolated island floating in the western Pacific Ocean, located at the southernmost tip of the Mariana Islands, nestled between Japan and the Philippines. Due to its unique geographical location, it has been a strategic military site since ancient times. Today, it is an important overseas territory of the United States. The island is dense with U.S. military bases, keeping it under the shadow of a potential storm all year round. Besides its strategic importance, Guam is also a vacation paradise. Its blue seas and skies attract many Asian travelers, especially tourists from Japan and South Korea. Guam International Airport, located east of the capital Hagåtña, is the only international civil aviation hub on the island, and a major cargo base for Asia-Pacific aviation. The story we are going to tell today took place at this very airport, but it all began over 3,000 kilometers away, in Seoul, South Korea. On August 5, 1997, a massive Boeing 747 passenger jet was parked at Seoul's Gimpo International Airport, undergoing boarding procedures. This model was the first jumbo jet introduced by Boeing and the world's first wide-body jet, known as the Queen of the Skies. With 4 powerful engines, a unique double-deck design, and a massive passenger capacity, it has been the mainstay of transoceanic routes. Decades. The specific model parked at the airport was a Boeing 747-300 with the registration number HL7468. It was delivered to Korean Air on December 12, 1984, with 50,105 total flight hours and 8,552 takeoff and landing cycles. The 12-year-old plane was in its prime and in very stable condition. The flight route for this trip was from Gimpo International Airport to Guam International Airport. The journey was about 3,200 kilometers, with an estimated flight time of over 4 hours. This was a scheduled international flight for Korean Air, designated as Korean Air Flight 801. For the sake of convenience, we will simply call it Flight 801. The crew for this flight was as follows. The captain was 42-year-old Park Yong-chul, a former South Korean Air Force pilot with 8,932 hours of flight experience, including 3,192 hours on the Boeing 747, making him highly experienced. He had won a Flight Safety Award for successfully landing a Boeing 747 that suffered an engine failure at low altitude. It is worth mentioning that he was originally scheduled for the Dubai route, but due to consecutive shifts without enough rest, he was reassigned to the shorter flight to Guam. The first officer was 40-year-old Song Jae-ho, who was also a military veteran. He had 4,066 hours of flight experience, with 1,560 of them on the Boeing 747. The flight engineer was 57-year-old Nam Suk-hun, with 13,065 hours of flight experience. 1,573 of those were on the Boeing 747, showing his extensive experience. In addition to the 3 pilots, there were 14 flight attendants, plus 237 passengers. A total of 254 people were on board before takeoff. It was 9:53 p.m. on August 5th, after completing the pre-flight checklists and receiving takeoff clearance. At the captain's command, the aircraft began its acceleration down the runway. It quickly reached V1 speed, followed by VR. Amidst the intense roar of the 4 engines, the plane successfully took off and headed toward distant Guam. The captain was in charge of flying, while the first officer and flight engineer assisted. The aircraft soon climbed to a cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. Since most of the route was over the Pacific Ocean, and with the help of autopilot, the crew was quite relaxed. As long as the instruments showed no errors, there was basically nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, the cabin gradually quieted down. Since it was a night flight, many passengers began to rest as soon as they boarded. Of course, some were exceptionally excited, looking forward to a few hours later, standing on the beaches of Guam, to watch the beautiful sunrise. 3 hours passed in the blink of an eye. As the aircraft gradually approached Guam, the crew began preparing for landing. However, a minor problem arose. Affected by the outer bands of a tropical storm, the aircraft began to experience some turbulence. Although this wouldn't pose a threat to a jumbo jet like the Boeing 747, the poor weather would affect visibility, adding uncertainty and risk to the landing. More troublesome was the flight briefing showing. The glide slope at Guam International Airport was out of service. This meant the crew had to use a non-precision approach. To help you understand what follows, let us explain briefly. In the field of modern civil aviation, there is a vital tool known as the ILS. Its technical name is the ILS. This is a precision landing guidance system, whose core function is to provide guidance in low visibility, such as in thick fog, heavy rain, or low clouds. It provides pilots with precise horizontal and vertical guidance. To help the plane land safely, you can imagine it as an invisible highway in the sky. ILS consists of two independent subsystems. The localizer signal provides horizontal guidance to keep the plane centered on the runway. The glide slope signal provides vertical guidance to ensure the aircraft descends at the correct angle. It works by having ground equipment emit two radio waves at different frequencies. Once captured by onboard equipment, it shows if the plane is at the right position and altitude. Crew just needs to adjust based on these cues. With ILS assistance, landing in bad weather becomes manageable. But the glide slope at Guam International Airport is unavailable. This means vertical guidance is gone. Although for an experienced captain, this isn't a major issue, it does add an element of risk. To make matters worse, the latest weather report shows Guam is covered by the outer bands of a tropical storm. The captain's biggest hope is that it won't rain in Guam. Otherwise, night, heavy rain, and a non-precision approach, combined together, create a situation no pilot wants to face. Soon the crew contacts Guam ATC. Guam Center, this is Korean Air 801. We are descending from 41,000 feet to 2,600 feet. Korean Air 801, radar contact. Continue your descent to 2,600 feet. The plane enters a steady descent. Soon, they are only 270 kilometers from Guam. ATC reports it's raining there, and it's coming down hard. Their worst fears are coming true. Their data also shows visibility is only 6 miles, with clouds at 500 and 2,000 feet. Crew's spirits sink instantly. The captain stares at the weather radar. A massive storm shows up like a red wall on the screen. Though they request a 10-mile left deviation to avoid it, they find there's no way around. They have no choice but to push forward. The plane soon reaches 10,000 feet. Crew reports to ATC again. Guam Center, Korean Air 801, level at 10,000 feet. Korean Air 801, continue to 2,600 feet. Runway 6L glide slope is out of service. As the plane descends further, rain intensifies. The crew peers through the windshield for runway lights, but they see only darkness. Just then, something unexpected happens. At 1 hour 39 minutes 30 seconds Guam time, the glide slope signal suddenly appears. The corresponding needle on the instrument panel begins to move. Seeing the signal, the tension in the cockpit instantly breaks. The three of them almost laugh out loud. By following the vertical guidance, they can land safely. No more worrying about not being able to see the runway. The crew then systematically set the flaps and lowered the landing gear. The airspeed also steadily decreased to 160 knots. But the problem was that when the plane was from the Guam Navade, only 5 nautical miles away, they still could not see the runway lights. The captain thought it was lucky the glide slope signal returned. Otherwise, it would be really hard to land in this darkness. The aircraft continued its descent, soon reaching 1,000 feet. At this moment, the GPWS began calling out the altitude above ground. Normally, at such a low altitude, the runway lights should be easy to spot. Outside, it remained pitch black. The first officer and flight engineer grew anxious. To make matters worse, as the rain intensified, the captain had to turn on the wipers, further obstructing their already poor visibility. 1 hour 42 minutes 17 seconds. The GPWS called out an altitude of 200 feet. Even though the plane was already this low, the three of them still had not seen the runway lights. Something was clearly wrong. The first officer and flight engineer grew frantic and began gently reminding the captain, "We still don't see the airport, let's go around." However, the captain ignored them. He was convinced the plane was right over the runway, just hidden from view. He then continued the descent. 3 seconds later, at 1 hour 42 minutes 22 seconds, he suddenly shouted, "Go around!" Although his reaction was prompt, it was already too late. The GPWS blared the chilling altitude, 50 feet, 40 feet. The crew's hearts leaped into their throats. They prayed silently in their hearts, pull up now." But reality was cruel. 3 seconds later, at 1 hour 42 minutes 25 seconds, the massive fuselage of the 747 slammed into Nimitz Hill ahead. Because they were executing a go-around, the engines were at full power. Impact speed reached 230 kilometers. The fuselage was instantly torn apart. Fuel sprayed everywhere, followed by a massive explosion. The fire lit up the entire valley. Although the crash site was near Guam International Airport, the heavy rain and the forested slopes of Nimitz Hill meant ATC had no idea the plane had crashed. Even for several minutes after the accident, he was still wondering where the plane had gone. Till 8 minutes later, an emergency call from a resident broke the silence, reporting a massive fireball on Nimitz Hill. Flames had turned the mountainside red. The firefighter who received the news reported it immediately. The information was soon synchronized with ATC. Combined with the disappearance of Flight 801 from radar, the controller was stunned. Meanwhile, flying behind Flight 801, Ryan International Flight 789 also reported that, about 15 minutes ago, they saw the clouds glowing bright red. It was a bit eerie. We thought our eyes were playing tricks on us. We saw a massive fireball on the hillside, about 1.6 kilometers at our 3 o'clock. Two pieces of information confirmed each other. All hope and speculation vanished at that moment. Flight 801 had indeed crashed. Government immediately activated emergency protocols. Guam firefighters, police, military, and medics were deployed. However, the rescue was plagued from the start. It was late at night with heavy rain, and the crash site was in the steep jungle of Nimitz Hill. There were no existing roads there. The only access was a narrow, muddy, one-lane gravel and dirt path, used for maintaining the navade and pipeline. Worse still, the pipeline was severed by the plane, lying across the road and blocking the way, preventing the rescue vehicles from moving forward. Firefighters tried to move the heavy pipe by hand, but they failed. Time was ticking away. The rescue team quickly split into two groups. One group left the vehicles to go on foot, carrying flashlights and gear through the dark rain. The other used winches to clear the road. Hindered by the darkness and heavy rain, the first team, relying on faint flashlight beams, finally pushed through the dense jungle and reached the crash site. What greeted them was a hellish scene. The entire plane was nearly engulfed in flames. Debris was scattered across the hillside, and fuel was still sizzling as it burned. The rescuers' hearts sank instantly, for such a scene usually meant no survivors. Yet, in that moment of despair, faint cries for help came from the wreckage. There were actually survivors in such a devastating crash. It was nothing short of a miracle. In fact, despite the high speed of impact, the plane was very close to the ground. Coupled with the cushioning of the soil, the impact didn't reach the level of total destruction. So inside that pile of twisted wreckage, over 10 survivors woke up in time, crawled out of the debris by supporting each other. The rescue team found them immediately. Meanwhile, other firefighters, ignoring the risk of fuel leaks and explosions, forced their way into the burning cabin to check on the passengers one by one. During this time, the other team, after an hour of effort, finally cleared the road. More search and rescue forces then arrived. Although the rain suppressed the fire, leaking fuel still caused occasional small explosions. Fortunately, there were no further casualties. Search and rescue in the mud, dark, and rain lasted throughout the entire night. At 7:10 in the morning, the last survivor was found and immediately rushed to the hospital. In the end, 31 survivors were found. Sadly, 2 passengers died on the way to the hospital, with 3 more passing within 30 days. Passed away as their injuries worsened. 2 months later, another victim passed away. The final death toll rose to 229, with only 25 survivors. This crash became the worst aviation accident to occur in a U.S. territory and the 4th deadliest in U.S. history, excluding terror attacks. While search and rescue efforts were underway, an investigation into the crash began simultaneously. The National Transportation Safety Board led the probe, with Boeing and Korean officials assisting. The plane crashed on Nimitz Hill, 5 kilometers southwest of the airport, at an altitude of about 660 feet. It was only 6 kilometers from the runway 6L threshold. When investigators arrived at the crash site, they were met with a horrific scene. The main wreckage was scattered in a densely wooded ravine. Fuselage had broken into 5 main sections. The debris field was long and narrow, 640 meters long and 122 meters wide. Fragments of the plane, snapped trees, and deep gouges in the earth littered the area. From the crash path, the impact began at 673 feet and ended at 582 feet in the wreckage zone. Fortunately, the 2 scorched black boxes were successfully recovered and immediately sent to Washington for analysis. During decoding, the team used radar data and ATC recordings to piece together the truth of the disaster. ATC reported no distress signals from the crew. There were no mayday calls, and all communications seemed normal. The crash happened without any warning. Radar data revealed that the plane's descent profile was strange. Normally, during a non-precision approach, without a glide slope signal, the descent should be a step-down pattern. Much like descending a staircase, descend a bit, then fly level, then descend again and fly level once more, while maintaining a minimum descent altitude. The MDA for Guam International Airport is 560 feet. The pilot must level off at this altitude until the runway lights are visible. Only then can the final landing proceed. If the lights aren't seen, a go-around is mandatory. This is an ironclad rule. However, Flight 801's actual descent was a continuous downward slope, resembling a premature precision approach. It was this very slope that led the plane directly into Nimitz Hill. This raises a critical question. The airport's glide slope transmitter that night was actually shut down. It could not have been a signal. Even more bizarre, this descent slope began much earlier than a standard glide slope. This was clearly wrong. Why would an experienced crew fly such a strange path? Only the black box could provide the answer. Despite the damaged casing, the data inside was perfectly preserved. Using the decoded data, the investigation team reconstructed the entire crash. August 5th at 9:53 p.m. Guam time, Korean Air Flight 801 took off from Gimpo International Airport, then climbed steadily to a cruise altitude of 41,000 feet. Over 3 hours later, the aircraft, around 1 a.m. on August 6th, entered the area around Guam. The captain then gave a standard and clear approach briefing. LS frequency 110.3, Nimitz Hill Navade frequency 115.3, heading 63 degrees, visibility 6 miles. Since the glide slope signal is not working, we will perform a non-precision approach. The MDA is 560 feet. The height above touchdown is 304 feet. There were no issues with this briefing. Professional, accurate, and rigorous. 5 minutes later, the crew contacted Guam ATC and was cleared to descend from 41,000 feet to 2,600 feet. Everything was normal so far. But in the cockpit voice recorder, an ominous conversation was repeatedly captured. The captain said, "Man, I'm so sleepy. I need a coffee to keep me going right after we land. I heard the airport coffee is quite good." The first officer agreed. "Yeah, I'm exhausted too." A few minutes later, they complained again. "Man, This flight is so tiring. You can say that again. Today's schedule is a mess. Yeah, the company's scheduling is getting tighter, with insufficient rest time. When ATC reported heavy rain in Guam, the captain complained for a third time. I've been so tired lately. If this round trip was over 9 hours, we'd at least get some overtime pay. But in under 8 hours, we get nothing at all. The airline only cares about cutting costs, saving on hotel expenses, and squeezing us to our limits. Man, I'm really sleepy. From these 3 consecutive complaints, the crew was clearly in a state of extreme fatigue, which became painfully obvious later on. The plane continued its descent, but at 1 hour 39 minutes 30 seconds, a signal that shouldn't have been there appeared. Glide slope signal suddenly came to life. The needles on the instrument panel began to move. Actually, this was just signal interference. That should not have been trusted. The briefing and ATC had repeatedly stated that the glide slope was unusable. Yet the 3 crew members were still misled by the sudden signal. They even laughed out of excitement. The flight engineer asked, "Is the glide slope back?" The captain replied, "Yes, it's back. We can use it." But after checking, the first officer clearly stated that the glide slope was not usable. Logically, with the first officer's reminder, the captain should have continued the non-precision approach. In fact, he did say one thing: maintain 1,440 feet. This was correct. This is the normal non-precision approach procedure. The aircraft reaches the final approach fix. This is 5 nautical miles in front of the navade. The altitude must not be below 1,440 feet. Descent to the MDA is allowed only after passing this point. As mentioned, this was at the Guam airport. This MDA is 560 feet. Captain did set this altitude, so he knew exactly what he should do. But somehow he forgot it all in an instant. He did not follow the step-down approach pattern. Instead, he followed a false glide slope signal. He continued to descend along the slope. Even worse, he was under poor visibility and extreme fatigue. The captain seemed to suffer spatial disorientation. He was unsure of the aircraft's position. He relied on his past training in Korea. He assumed the airport navade was on the runway. Passing the navade meant being over the airport. In reality, the Guam navade was elsewhere. It was 3.3 nautical miles from the airport. It was located on Nimitz Hill. He acted based on his past experience. He started descending after passing the navade. He was still 3.3 nautical miles away. He landed the plane prematurely. He believed the plane was right in front of the airport. Little did he know a fatal ridge was ahead at 680 feet. As the aircraft approached the peak, the GPWS kept announcing the altitude. 142.19. The plane was only 200 feet off the ground. There was clearly a major problem. First officer and flight engineer grew anxious. They began whispering reminders to the captain. "We can't see the runway lights. Let's go around." Yet the captain firmly believed his position. He thought the aircraft was already over the runway. He believed that the rain was too heavy. It was simply obscuring the runway lights. So he continued the descent. 3 seconds later, he shouted, "Go around!" But it was already too late. The peak was right in front of them. The aircraft slammed straight ahead. It hit Nimitz Hill at 680 feet. This was the situation at that point. The truth of the crash seems quite clear. It was fatigue, poor training, bad weather, and cognitive error. A series of such factors combined. Together, they caused the tragedy. But a few questions still need answers. First, why did the glide slope signal suddenly recover? The investigation team conducted several tests. The glide slope transmitter was actually off. The avionics might have picked up interference. These were stray radio signals from nearby facilities. This caused a false glide slope indication. This signal was very unstable and intermittent, but the fatigued captain still trusted it. Second, why were the alert observers silent? The recording clearly shows the situation. The first officer and flight engineer were more alert, especially the first officer. They reminded the captain several times that the glide slope was unavailable. Seeing no runway lights, they urged to go around. But why couldn't they stop the captain in time? This was mainly because Korean Air had a strict hierarchy back then. Inside the cockpit, the captain's authority was absolute. As subordinates, the first officer and flight engineer only dared to give cautious, polite reminders. This indirectness led the captain to ignore them. Finally, did the airport have provided an early warning? There were actually warning facilities. On Nimitz Hill, an MSAW system was installed. When it detects an aircraft descending below the minimum safety altitude, the system alerts the Air Traffic Control Center. It alerts 64 seconds before impact, covering 54 nautical miles around Nimitz Hill. Those 64 seconds were enough for ATC to notify the tower, who would then alert the crew, thus preventing this tragedy. But the problem was that it had been modified, rendering this safety net useless. Due to a high number of previous false alarms, the system's threshold was manually raised. It would only trigger within a narrow band, between 54 and 55 nautical miles. Flight 801 happened to be outside this band. Additionally, air traffic control was also at fault. The approach controller initially in charge, Kurt James Mayo, became lax after handing the flight over to the tower, and failed to continue monitoring as required. If he had kept watching the radar, he would have seen the plane was dangerously low. Meanwhile, the tower controller, Marty Theobald, was completely unaware that Flight 801 was far below the safety altitude, and thus issued no warning. However, neither man faced severe punishment. They only expressed their heartfelt apologies. On January 13, 2000, after over 2 years of investigation, the team released its final report. The report clearly stated that the direct cause of the crash was the captain's failure to follow the briefing and correctly execute a non-precision approach. The first officer and flight engineer also failed to monitor and cross-check effectively. Other factors cannot be ignored either. In addition to the reasons above, the crew was using an outdated approach chart. The chart did not mark a 724-foot obstacle located at the Nimitz Navade. It also incorrectly labeled the minimum safety altitude for the Nimitz Navade as 1,300 feet, and it was actually 1,440 feet. While a newer approach chart might not have prevented the tragedy, it would have improved the crew's situational awareness and vigilance. In short, this was not a crash caused by a single error. The investigation team noted the following. Korean Air 801 was not a simple pilot error. It resulted from failures in system, culture, and communication. Multiple links in the chain broke simultaneously. Therefore, they proposed several safety recommendations. They urged the Federal Aviation Administration to act. They must fully inspect navigation equipment nationwide. This ensures that no false signals are emitted. Guam must optimize its MSAW. Must ensure it is truly effective. Korean Air must strengthen its crew management. Pilots must be brave enough to speak up. Stricter scheduling systems must be enforced. There must be clear requirements for rest. Crew behavior under fatigue must be monitored. The industry should accelerate the adoption of technology. This includes using smarter EGPWS. Aircraft shouldn't just alert when seeing terrain. They should provide warnings well in advance. This gives the crew more time to react. Search and rescue continued for several days. Victim identification progressed slowly. Over 50 families of the victims gathered. They protested at Guam Airport. Families were angry and desperate. They questioned the rescue efficiency. They also questioned the airline's safety management. An international lawsuit followed the crash. It was settled for $70 million. But money can never truly heal the pain. Cannot mend those shattered families. After this crash, Korean Air took action. They suspended the route to Guam. This suspension lasted for 4 full years. Tourism in Guam declined during those 4 years. This caused massive losses for Korean Air. It also devastated the local tourism industry. In December 2001, things changed. Korea resumed its flight route to Guam. One detail is worth mentioning. Barry, a survivor from New Zealand, spoke out. He later publicly blamed the airline. Duty-free alcohol was stored improperly. Storage fueled the fire on Flight 801. Seat beam design flaws also hindered escape. Barry actively pushed for safety changes. These 2 improvements were adopted globally. They make today's aircraft much safer. Looking back at this tragedy is painful. It is truly heartbreaking to consider. Flight 801 had nearly finished its journey. It crashed in the final 3 minutes of landing. There was the flight engineer's quiet warning. There was the first officer's weak questioning. There was the captain's stubborn judgment. There was the airline's pressure from fatigue. There were also residual signals from the airport. No single factor was enough on its own. Could not destroy this jumbo jet alone. But these factors were fatal when combined. They were deadlier than any storm. Flight 801 paid a heavy price in lives. It sounded a loud alarm for global aviation safety. Strict fatigue management was implemented. Crew coordination was significantly enhanced. Smart warning systems were introduced. A tighter safety net has now been woven. It reminds us that safety is never a given, but a precious outcome of countless lessons. Behind every safe takeoff and landing is the industry's deep remembrance of historical tragedies and its ultimate respect for life.